So what will be the impact of the trade tensions between China and the U.S. on the global economy, particularly with the latest development likely to have an impact on the global supply chain? Let's turn to our panelists. In Beijing studio, Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation, Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. In New York, Max Wolf, Professor at the New School University. In London, Ian Beck, Professor at the European Institute and Co-Director of the Darendorf Forum of the London School of Economics and Political Science. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, A. Sun O, Senior Fellow, Singapore Institute of International Affairs. Gentlemen, welcome to the four of you. Listening to the latest interview, Professor Wolf, by Huawei founder Ren Zhengfei. Of course, a lot of people applauded his attitude as a global company head, but at the same time, what do you think might be the impact on the global supply chain, given Huawei as one of the first examples?
So great to be here. Thank you for having me, and a good question. I think what we sort of already beginning to see is that for many segments of the world economy and for many people, and in many ways, really, there is not an American economy and a Chinese economy, but there is a global economy, and it's an integrated global supply chain. So when you think about the smartphone, almost all the actual physical handsets and accessories are now manufactured in China. But the operating systems tend to be manufactured here in North America, whether that's the iOS operating system popularized by the iPhone line from Apple, or if it's really the many, many lines using Android. And these two pieces are both more or less useless apart. So the operating system without the handset is useless code, and the handset without the operating system is far less smart of a smartphone. I think it's a perfect analogy. I think that everyone succeeds when we work together, and pretty quickly we're going to see that almost everybody loses when we don't. And the question is, when can that truth overwhelm the sort of nationalism and the political expediency of the moment?
Well, I guess that's a question for everybody, isn't it, Professor Beck? For the UK, I understand it is, for the moment, suspending what you call the telecom supply chain review provided to the government about what kind of 5G network to use. Earlier, there was talk about the May administration likely to adopt Huawei, but now with the U.S. president likely to visit the UK early June, that plan seems to be postponed. What do you think might be the impact from your country?
Well, if we end up with an inferior 5G because we aren't able to use the state-of-the-art provided by Huawei, then we as a country lose. But I think there's a wider question here about what's being done on the global stage by this kind of policy, which is the exercise of what some are now calling sharp power. We're used to the distinction between hard and soft power, but what's being used here is a kind of sharp power where the US in particular is trying to bully or to coerce other countries to follow their particular line on something like technology. It's the same with the Iran question. So it's a new phenomenon in international relations.
It is quite an interesting phenomenon, to say the least. Europe and North America are not the only places that's likely to be impacted by that, but also, and probably particularly, Asia. Mr. O, let me go to you. 51% of the semiconductor for the year 2017 produced in Asia are being exported to the Chinese market. Of course, Huawei is a big buyer of the semiconductor, mainly from South Korea, from economies like Taiwan, or some of those in Southeast Asia. So what do you think, if things like this continue to go on, will be impact on economies in your region, sir?
Well, up to about 15% of Malaysia's exports, for example, electronic components, which are first exported to China for further incorporation into components, which are then exported to the United States. So if the United States, for example, imposes a 25% tariffs on these products, well, then, well, in Malaysia's case, up to at least 15% of our export are also affected. So indeed, it has a chain effect beyond China. I mean, this imposition of high tariffs. And I think this is but the first step. China is the American target for the moment because it is the largest trading partner of the United States. But at the same time, the United States, I think, is also targeting Japan, the European Union, and after this, I think it will be Southeast Asia's turn. So we are just waiting to see what will happen to us as exports to the United States are incurring high tariffs. Yes.
That domino effect, that certainly is what the administration now in Washington are expecting. But will that likely to happen now? Mr. Zhang, sitting in Beijing, you listened attentively to the press conference given by Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei. Of course, he is suggesting the U.S. was underestimate Huawei in the sense that where the technology is already approaching and also its cooperation worldwide. What do you make of it?
In my mind, in the past 30 years, actually Huawei mainly focusing on, IT sector and the telecommunication sectors and provided equipment and services in so lot of countries, more than 100 countries in the world. Today, if you look at 5G patent and standard pool, you may find that Huawei already occupied more than 28%, close to 29%. Second place, that is, Ericsson, just 22%. And the third one, that is Samsung, only 20%. If you look at Intel, located on the fifth place. If you look at Polar, code editing standard, you may find that Huawei already, occupied 49%. Very amazing. But second place, that is Ericsson, only 25%.
So you are saying that if the U.S. market is losing Huawei or other markets losing Huawei, or by choice, that would mean a big loss for them? Is that what you're trying to say?
I mean,
or are you trying to say that Huawei could flex its muscles and be able to so-called, quote-unquote, punish those markets that are not welcoming Huawei? What exactly are you trying to indicate here?
I like to say that today, actually, in 5G, this field, actually, the company from the U.S. side already behind Huawei, and Huawei becomes a leading corporation. They can, do software, hardware, and basic, station and final equipment, as well as chips and other. So that means Huawei will lead in this field, but the United States cannot accept this situation in the future. This is the first point. And the second one is I like to say Huawei actually behind Huawei. So more than 100 countries, their parts, their services will provided to Huawei and assembled in China and in other countries and then export to global market. In that process, if U.S. punished Huawei, that means the U.S. punished all of those partnerships in the world.
Well, Huawei, as we said very early, is one of those examples of global companies that if you cut off one huge global company from the rest of the world, or intentionally to do that, what would happen to the rest of the world, right? But on the other hand, Professor Wolf, let me go to you. We understand the geopolitical situation. We also understand the political realities in Washington now. So to naively dreaming that politics will not have an impact on companies like Huawei or other global companies is relatively unrealistic. What do you think, though, these companies can do?
Yeah, so certainly, and I think largely unfortunately, we've seen the role of political risk move over into the role of investment and economic risk. And because the sort of flashpoint of the moment has been the basic governing philosophy of the Trump administration. So the President of the United States seems to thrive in a chaotic environment where there's tons of media attention and excitement around whoever he's accusing of what in that moment. And to the extent that that has been a successful strategy, I think we'd have to be ready to see it again. I think that we have also reached the tipping point, however, though, when the rhetorical angers and accusations have spilled over into real policy actions. So 15 to 25% tariffs are real policy actions, and that means American consumers pay enhanced taxes and Chinese producers pay higher in terms of what they have to do to enter the U.S. market. What I think people haven't really figured out is that will quickly become rationing and redistribution of technological capability in contracts. And once you put your finger on the scale that measures global success, there are a series of ripple effects that are both hard to foresee and quite problematic from an efficiency perspective.
I guess there are two issues right here. One is, of course, what's going to happen to the global supply chain. What does it mean for every player on that global supply chain, company-wise, country-wise? The other thing is whether the so-called Iron Curtain in the so-called technical war has already begun, whether it is between China and the United States or likely between two systems, technical systems, I mean, for the future. So, Professor Begg, given your sophistication of history, what do you make of the nature of reality we're facing right now, sir?
Well, you're right to anticipate the possibility of some sort of technological Iron Curtain. But there are consequences which follow from that. And the most important one is that when you have that kind of exclusion from a market, you create an enormous incentive to try to find a way around it through developing your own technology. If we consider the case of Huawei, I don't want to dwell on it too much, but their problem is they have to prove a negative. They have to prove they're not supplying data to the Chinese government, which is the security accusation from the US. At the same time, the US is trying to...
Professor Wolf, Professor Begg, if I could, first of all, there's no concrete evidence about the accusation that they are supporting or providing data to the whatever government. And therefore, how would they prove that they are not? Because the evidence of yes do not even exist at all. So it's an interesting argument.
But that's precisely my point, that they're being asked to prove a negative, which is far harder than proving a positive. And the response is likely to be from Huawei, given this enormous research capability they have both in Shenzhen and in north of Beijing, that they're going to develop their own alternative to Android if they're excluded from Google collaboration. And in this sense, what may well happen is that the repercussions for American technology companies may be far more damaging in the medium term than they realize, that they could lose from creating a new rival who wasn't there in the first place. And that's to some extent been the case with the 5G development. And the second thing is that the US is also engaging in commercial opposition. It's mixing up the security and the commercial arguments in a way which is really unfolding.
Well, Mr. Zhang, today at the press conference, Mr. Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, said it very loud and clear that he is having issues with some of the politicians, do not necessarily have issues with the business community in the United States, nor does he or his company have any issues with the American people. I guess that could be said about any other markets in the world as well. So to you, what if that Iron Curtain, that some of the political forces just wish it would be there? And what kinds of reactions and initiatives that Chinese companies, particularly Chinese global companies, will be able to put forward in order to dampen the negative effect of what many consider as the Iron Curtain in a technical war?
Personally, I don't think a so-called Iron Curtain of technology will come true. Because you know that today we are living at globalization age. Meanwhile, you know that every country, actually, we are cooperating on global supply chain. We are relying on each other. For example, if you look at the 5G system, actually there are so big, patent pools and different cooperation from different countries. They have different advantages. They have different patents. They need to pay each other. They also need to work together, to cooperate together. In case you hope to, separate all of them, And that means, we will back to, many, many years ago. So in this regard, I think that maybe this time, the U.S., politician, decision making for Huawei will cause maybe very possible disasters. But I don't think that that situation will last forever. I think that most of countries, most of corporations, companies in the world on globalized supply chain, they will work together in order to, prevent the possible bad results.
What about that sharp power that Professor Begg earlier mentioned, Mr. Oh, in Malaysia? Will that have an impact on the economies? As you mentioned, the current administration in the U.S. is trying to have a deal, quote unquote, in their favor only, one after another with the other players in the world. So what do you think that your parts of the world could do, and what do you make of the nature of cooperation, for example, with the Chinese economy for the future from those in Southeast Asia?
Well, the United States projection of sharp power, it's a rather curious one, because previously when the United States were projecting their powers, they will be projecting what I would call full throttle powers, both military and economic powers. But it would appear that nowadays the United States are more intent on projecting their economic superiority and associated, sharp powers. As for Southeast Asia, of course, for many years over the past half century, we followed the U.S. leads in promoting free trade, right? And even up to the very last U.S. administration, the Obama administration, free trade was at the tip of our tongue. Some of us may still remember the United States was pushing for this TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, very hotly. And many of Southeast Asian countries, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on, signed on to it. And when Trump became president, he simply announced that the United States was withdrawing from the TPP. So I think what Trump was trying to achieve was such that a lot of American businesses would so-called go back to the U.S. and reopen a lot of factories, for example, in the so-called Rust Belt of the United States, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and so on. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to work a lot because, American businesses that left the United States because of, for example, high labor costs and extremely stringent environmental regulations. So as long as those provisions are still there, I don't think American businesses are going back to the United States.
My final round of topic for all of you will be, as we look at the realities evolve about U.S.-China trade dispute, not likely to have an immediate consensus if you look at the recent development, just to tell the least. So what would other economies do? Meanwhile, you heard that rhetorics coming from Washington, Professor Begg, have been suggesting, why can't we do just as we did with Japan 40 years ago in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, so-called working with our allies to bring Japan to line in a way. And why can't we do that about China now? Professor Begg, what do you think of that analysis and analogy today?
It only works up to a point, because you have to look at the arithmetic of this. The Chinese economy today is as big as the American economy, or very close to being as big as the American economy, whereas the Japanese one was only ever about 1/4 of the size of the US economy. So what you see is a new global rivalry between the two potential superpowers. Europe collectively may have the same sort of economic weight as the US or China, but Europe is fragmented, so the only real rivalry is between G2, if you want to call them that. So I think that there is an epochal change going on between the balance between an up-and-coming China and a gradually shrinking US hegemony in all of this, which is the basis for a lot of what's been going on. But let's not forget as well that we have other interests in all the countries. We barely mentioned consumers.
Yeah.
Consumers may rebel and say to Trump, this won't do.
Because the prices of products do likely to raise as a result of the tariffs, just as simple as that. Mr. Oh, what do you think? Will that analogy work today?
Well, as I said before, 40 years ago it was a very different world with the United States being the sole market economy or superpower market economy in the world. So they could, for example, sort of browbeat Japan into submission in terms of opening up its market and so on. But today, China's economy, according to various measures, is comparable to that of the United States. So it's very difficult to try to put a century in forcing China to do the same as Japan did nearly 40 years ago.
I see. Very briefly from you, Professor Wolf, and very briefly also from Mr. Zhang. Professor Wolf, you go first.
Yeah, sure. I don't think the analogy worked actually with the Japan-U.S. relations either. So 30 years into a Japanese recession, none of the businesses we were seeking to protect had the resurgent growth and employment in the United States that people looked for. And part of the problem with framing the question as incorrectly as our administration has here in the U.S. is when you start with a wrong premise, it's very hard to build a right solution.
Yeah.
I think technology makes changes, and it's the society's job to keep people's lives and opportunities up to date with the changing world. I don't think you can drag other people down to prevent your own issues. So I think it's the wrong framing of the question. That being said, I think China's a different power at a different moment in the world and a different pace in its growth curve. So I think it would also fail if applied to the Chinese case.
Mr. Zhang, very briefly also.
Yeah, please don't forget that 40 years ago, Japanese was carried by the United States. So every time Japanese need to learn from those, required doing from the U.S. But today, China is quite different from Japan in the history. China, U.S. actually as a big country. The U.S. need to respect the Chinese side. Also, we need to discuss, a fair, agreement between us.
All right. Zhang Jianping, Max Wolf, Ian Begg, Sam Oh. Thank you so much for the four of you gentlemen for being with us. Really appreciate it for this discussion.